I was told the paperwork for that facility didn't exist, and neither did the man we kept alive beneath the sand. No insignia, no flag, no laws, just heat, concrete, and silence. I signed an NDA thicker than a Bible and carried a rifle that would never be logged. But what still wakes me up at night isn't what we did there. It's the prisoner, because he was not human, and worse, he was not hostile. Welcome to Combat Law Files, where the shadows of war live on. Hit subscribe and get nightly drops of stories like this. The assignment didn't come with a destination, only a warning that if I asked where I was going, I'd be replaced. I was 3 months into what should have been a quiet contract when the message came through, a scrambled transmission that chewed up my radio before settling into a voice stripped of accent, rank, or warmth. My call sign, my last name, then a pause long enough to feel intentional. I was told to pack light, burn my current credentials, and be ready by 300. No mission brief, no coordinates, just one sentence that stuck with me more than the rest. This assignment has no paper trail. In my line of work, that usually meant black site transport or off-books detainees, the kind of jobs you didn't ask about if you wanted to get paid and go home breathing. I told myself that's all it was. I told myself a lot of things that night. The convoy rolled out before dawn, headlights taped over, running on infrared and muscle memory. 6 vehicles, no markings, no flags. We drove in silence through a desert that felt too vast to belong to any country I recognized. My phone had been confiscated. My GPS unit was dead weight. Even the radio chatter was reduced to click acknowledgements and breathing. I remember watching the horizon turn from black to a bruised purple, the sun bleeding up from the sand like it was being forced out. Nobody spoke. Nobody smoked. It felt less like deployment and more like burial. After several hours, the road disappeared. Not ended, just ceased to exist, swallowed by sand like it had never been there to begin with. We followed a set of metal stakes hammered into the ground at irregular intervals, each one painted with symbols that weren't numbers or letters. They looked older, carved with intent rather than precision. When I leaned out to get a better look, the driver snapped at me to sit back and keep my eyes forward. His voice cracked when he said it. That should have been my first real warning. We passed a cluster of low stone buildings sometime near midday. Locals, nomads, maybe. They stood still as we rolled by, faces rapt, eyes exposed and unblinking. No waves, no hostility, just watching. One of them drew a line in the sand with his foot, slow and deliberate, then stepped back from it like the ground itself was dangerous. I asked one of the guys riding shotgun what that meant. He didn't answer, just made a sign over his chest I hadn't seen since my grandmother's funeral back home. The facility revealed itself all at once, like it had been waiting for us to notice it. No perimeter fence, no watchtowers, just concrete half buried in sand, angular and brutal, as if it had been poured directly into the desert and forgotten. Heat shimmered around it, warping the air, making straight lines bend. There were no flags, no signage, no helipad markings. The only thing that moved was the wind, dragging sand across the structure in long, whispering sheets that sounded uncomfortably like voices if you listened too hard. We were processed without ceremony. New IDs issued with no names, only numbers. Weapons inspected, serials removed. Rules delivered flat and final. No personal effects, no questions, no radios beyond internal channels, no leaving your assigned level without clearance that would never come. One of the officers reciting the protocol hesitated when he got to the final rule, like he didn't like the taste of it. If you hear anything unusual, report it. If you see anything unusual, report it. If you feel anything unusual. He stopped there, jaw tightening, then continued, report it immediately. My quarters were underground, like everything else. The air smelled recycled and dry, but beneath that was something else, something mineral and old, like stone that had been sealed away for centuries and only recently disturbed. The lights hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. Somewhere deep in the facility, I felt a pressure in my ears, the way you do when a storm is coming or an explosion is imminent. Except there was no storm, just silence. Thick, deliberate silence, like the building itself was holding its breath. On my first patrol, I noticed the clocks didn't sync. Digital displays disagreed by seconds, then minutes. Analog hands ticked unevenly. I mentioned it to another contractor, a former Marine with a scar running from his eyebrow to his cheek. He shrugged it off, said, "Desert heat messes with equipment." But he didn't meet my eyes when he said it, and his hand never strayed far from the grip of his rifle. At shift change, I overheard two technicians arguing in low voices near an access door marked with no number, only a symbol etched into the steel. One of them kept saying the word "sight" like it wasn't enough, like he needed a different word and couldn't find it. The other told him to shut up before it noticed. When they realized I was there, the conversation died instantly. One of them crossed himself, the other just stared at me like I'd already seen too much. That night, I dreamed of the convoy again, except this time we were driving in circles. The desert stretched on forever, but the sun never moved. The locals stood in the same place, drawing the same line in the sand over and over, their eyes following me even when I turned away. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, with the overwhelming sense that something deep below the facility had shifted, like a sleeper turning in its sleep. The next morning, during orientation, they finally told us why we were there. Not in detail, not really, just enough to frame the lie. "You're guarding a detainee," the briefing officer said, eyes fixed on a point just above our heads. "High value, non-transferable." Someone asked how many. The officer paused, just for a fraction of a second too long. "One." I thought the secrecy was about detainees, until I learned there was only one. They told me Sublevel 7 was just another secured corridor, but every man who rode the elevator down there stopped joking the moment the doors closed. The escort came for me at 2200, 2 hours into what should have been a routine perimeter rotation. No explanation, just a silent nod and a swipe of a badge that outranked mine by colors I didn't recognize. We walked past areas I hadn't been cleared for before. Labs humming with equipment that looked more medical than military. Observation rooms lined with one-way glass. Corridors where the lights dimmed automatically as we passed, like the building itself didn't want to waste energy acknowledging us. The air grew colder the deeper we went, not from climate control, but from something heavier, like the absence of heat rather than the presence of cold. The elevator to Sublevel 7 wasn't marked. No number, no letter, just a downward arrow etched into the metal panel, worn smooth as if it had been touched too many times. When the door slid shut, my escort finally spoke. "Once you're posted, you don't leave until relieved. If you hear anything, log it." I asked what I was guarding. He shook his head once. The elevator began its descent, and the pressure in my ears returned, sharper this time, accompanied by a low vibration I felt through the soles of my boots. Sublevel 7 opened into a single corridor that stretched farther than it should have. The walls were reinforced concrete layered with steel, scarred by old weld marks like previous modifications had been ripped out and replaced in a hurry. No signage, no directional arrows, just doors set at regular intervals, each sealed and silent. At the far end stood the one I was assigned to, a heavier door, thicker hinges, locking mechanisms layered on top of each other like redundancy born from fear rather than protocol. Above it, a single camera dome rotated slowly, endlessly, its soft mechanical whir the only sound down there. My post was directly in front of that door. A chair bolted to the floor, a small console with monitoring feeds, and a rifle rack fixed to the wall. No viewport, no food slot, no window of any kind. I checked the logs on the console, expecting to see interrogation schedules, maintenance rotations, something that explained activity. There was nothing. Just timestamps. And my predecessor's initials repeated over and over, each entry identical. No change. Hours, days, weeks of the same phrase. I settled in, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The cameras showed the interior of the cell from 3 angles. The room was bare, smooth stone walls, no visible seams, no drain, no fixtures except for a circular depression in the floor where something might have once been anchored. The prisoner stood in the center of the room, not restrained, not sedated, just standing, hands at his sides, head slightly bowed. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe, at least not in any way I could see. His skin tone was wrong, not pale, not dark, but the color of old parchment left too long in the sun. Minutes passed, then an hour. I watched for signs of life, for any shift in posture or expression, but there was nothing. Eventually I looked away, focusing on the hallway, on the steady glow of the lights, on anything that wasn't the screen. That was when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not from the cameras, from the door itself. The feeling crawled along my neck, settled between my shoulder blades, made my fingers tighten on the armrests of the chair. I glanced back at the feed. The prisoner's head was raised now, not fully. Just enough that his face angled toward the camera that pointed directly at me. Toward me. I checked the timestamp, then the motion alerts. No triggers, no recorded movement. Yet he was looking straight through layers of concrete and steel, eyes fixed exactly where I sat. I told myself it was coincidence. Paranoia. Long hours underground messing with my perception. Still, I logged it. Subject posture change observed. No system alert. My fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary before I finished the entry. When I looked up again, his head was bowed once more, as if he'd never moved at all. Shift after shift, the pattern repeated. He never sat, never lay down, never consumed the rations that were occasionally delivered to an empty antechamber beyond the cell. Meals that came back untouched, sealed, logged, and removed. Medical scans were performed remotely. No vitals displayed in any configuration I recognized. The scientists stopped using words like heart rate and respiration and started using terms I'd never heard before. When I asked one of them what they meant, he closed his tablet and told me to focus on my job. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the awareness. Every time I stepped into position, every time I shifted my weight or adjusted my rifle, I felt it, like an unseen pressure adjusting to me, acknowledging my presence. The cameras never showed movement, but I began to notice small discrepancies, shadows that didn't align with the lighting, reflections that lagged by a fraction of a second. Once, during a system reset, the feed flickered, and for a single frame, the prisoner's face was closer to the camera than physically possible. Eyes wide, mouth slightly open as if mid-word. I reported it. The response was immediate and cold. Do not speculate. Do not anthropomorphize. Continue observation. After that, I stopped mentioning specifics. I stuck to the approved language. No change. But the logs began to feel like lies, and I hated myself for typing them. Other guards rotated through Sublevel 7, though none stayed long. Some requested transfers. Others finished their assignments and left the facility altogether without explanation. One night, the Marine with the scar took the chair beside me during overlap. He didn't look at the screens, just stared at the door. I asked him what he meant. He swallowed hard. Before you turn the corner. Before the elevator even stops. On my next shift, I tested it. I lingered by the elevator longer than usual, adjusted my gear, made noise deliberately. When I finally reached my post and checked the feed, the prisoner's head was already raised, eyes fixed on the camera. On me. I felt my pulse in my throat. I didn't log that. Sleep became difficult. Even off duty, I dreamed of standing outside that door, of knocking and hearing something on the other side knock back, perfectly mimicking the rhythm of my own heart. The facility's silence followed me everywhere, clinging like dust. Conversations died when I entered rooms. People avoided eye contact. The word prisoner was never spoken aloud anymore. By the end of the week, I wasn't the only one noticing. Equipment failures clustered around Sublevel 7. Personnel complained of headaches, vertigo, sudden intrusive memories that didn't feel like their own. No alarms ever sounded, yet everyone agreed something was wrong. Something no briefing could explain. The desert had a memory long before we arrived, and once I learned its stories, I understood why it didn't want us there. I first heard the name from a man who refused to say it twice. He was a local contractor assigned to waste processing, one of the few civilians allowed anywhere near the outer levels of the facility. Older than most of us, skin leathered by sun and sand, eyes sharp with a kind of caution that didn't come from training. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He nodded like he already knew and muttered something in his language before switching to broken English. "The sand remembers," he said. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing how the locals behaved around the site. They never approached directly. Vehicles stopped at a distance, engines idling until guards waved them forward. Some refused to work night shifts altogether. Others wore charms beneath their uniforms. Small leather pouches, etched bone, twisted wire shaped into symbols I didn't recognize. One man was fired after being caught drawing circles in the sand around his sleeping quarters, whispering prayers until dawn. Officially, it was disciplinary. Unofficially, everyone understood. I started asking questions carefully, indirectly, the way you do when you know answers come with a cost. What I pieced together wasn't written anywhere. It lived in fragments, passed down like warnings rather than stories. Long before borders, before flags, before the desert had a name outsiders could pronounce, there was something buried beneath it. Not a god, not a demon, a witness. Something that watched civilizations rise, slaughter each other, and collapse back into sand. They called it many things across centuries, but the one that stuck translated roughly to the sand-bound witness. Not imprisoned, anchored. The legends said it didn't judge, it didn't intervene, it observed. When wars came, it remembered them. When blood soaked into the ground, it listened. And when men tried to bind it, to use it or silence it, the desert answered on its behalf. I would have dismissed all of it as superstition if the land itself hadn't started acting wrong. Storms began forming without warning, not the slow-building kind you could track on radar, but sudden walls of sand that rose out of clear skies and collapsed just as quickly. They never touched the facility directly. They circled it, wrapped around it, like something pacing a cage. Compasses spun uselessly within a mile of Sublevel 7. Drone footage glitched, horizons bending, footage cutting out whenever it passed over a specific stretch of ground that matched the depth of the prisoner's cell. Night patrols became a punishment detail. The desert cooled rapidly after sunset, heat bleeding away until the air felt thin and sharp. Sound carried strangely then. Footsteps echoed too long. Whispers seemed closer than they should have been. More than once, guards reported hearing voices carried on the wind. Not shouts, not commands, but rhythmic murmurs, rising and falling like chanting. Every report described it differently, yet all agreed on one thing. It wasn't coming from outside the perimeter. It was coming from below. I heard it myself during a graveyard rotation. The wind picked up suddenly, dragging sand along the walls with a hiss like static. Then beneath it, a pattern emerged. Not words I understood, but cadence, intent. It vibrated through my chest rather than my ears. I froze, heart hammering, scanning the darkness with my rifle raised, until the sound faded as abruptly as it had begun. When I checked the logs later, 3 other patrols had reported identical phenomena within the same 10-minute window. The facility command dismissed it all as environmental stress, psychological fatigue, desert madness. But their explanations grew thinner as incidents piled up. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that didn't align with heat damage. Power fluctuations synchronized across unrelated systems. One night, every clock on Sublevel 7 stopped simultaneously for exactly 60 seconds before resuming as if nothing had happened. No alarms, no errors. Just a minute carved cleanly out of time. The locals noticed too. Fewer showed up for work. Some quit without collecting final pay. One man returned his badge and simply said, "It is awake," before walking into the desert with no supplies. They never found him. The official report called it desert exposure. The older contractors shook their heads and said nothing. I found myself revisiting the stories late at night, replaying them against what I'd seen on the monitors. The prisoner's stillness, his awareness. The way Sublevel 7 felt less like a holding area and more like a foundation, something built around rather than over. The legends describe the witness as bound deep underground, anchored to stone older than memory, able to see the surface without eyes, to hear conflict through the ground itself. They said it knew when blood was spilled above it, knew when war returned to land it had already seen burn. One detail haunted me more than the rest. According to the stories, the witness did not speak until it was disturbed. As long as it was left to observe, the desert remained quiet. But when men tried to extract knowledge from it, visions, futures, outcomes, the land turned against them. Storms, madness, vanishing armies swallowed by sand. Empires erased so thoroughly they became myths themselves. I thought of the labs, the invasive scans, the scientists who spoke in hushed tones about data that didn't behave like data. I thought of Sublevel 7's door, reinforced beyond reason, and the way the prisoners seemed to anticipate every presence. I began to suspect the facility wasn't built to contain him. It was built to keep us from digging deeper. The realization settled heavy in my gut during a supply run when a sudden storm forced us to halt. Visibility dropped to nothing. Sand hammered the vehicles, screaming against metal like thousands of tiny fists. For a brief moment, through the chaos, I swore I saw shapes moving in the storm. Tall, indistinct silhouettes that vanished when I focused on them. The driver whispered a prayer under his breath. When we finally reached shelter, every compass in the convoy pointed straight down. That night, I returned to my post in Sublevel 7 with a new kind of dread. The legends were no longer distant folklore. They were context, and context made the truth harder to ignore. Whatever stood behind that door wasn't just a prisoner. It was the reason the land itself resisted us. It was the memory the desert refused to lose. I was still processing that thought when the monitors flickered and the prisoner did something that shattered every rule we had. He never opened his mouth, yet I heard him clearer than any order I'd ever been given. Graveyard shift on Sublevel 7 felt longer than time itself. The hours didn't move down there. They pooled. The lights hummed at a pitch just low enough to irritate the nerves, and the air pressed in like the corridor was slowly shrinking. I was alone, assigned double rotation because 2 guards had reported stress fractures and been medevaced out within the same week. Officially, dehydration. Unofficially, no one wanted the chair outside that door anymore. I sat with my back straight, rifle locked, eyes shifting between the hallway and the monitors. The prisoner stood where he always did, centered in the room, posture unchanged. No food tray had been delivered in days. No waste removed, no medical intervention. Yet nothing about him suggested hunger, weakness, or decay. He looked exactly as he had the first time I saw him, timeless in a way that felt deliberate, like erosion reversed. At 0317, every monitor flickered at once. Not a blackout, not static. Just a brief dimming, like someone had lowered the brightness of the world itself. My first instinct was to reach for the console, but my hands froze halfway there. The pressure returned, stronger than ever. compressing my chest, squeezing behind my eyes. My ears rang, not with sound, but with absence. Then the thought arrived. It wasn't a voice. There was no language, no sound, no direction. It bloomed, fully formed in my mind, heavy and undeniable, like a memory I'd forgotten I had. "You are early," it said, or meant, or implied. The distinction stopped mattering immediately. I lurched back in the chair, heart slamming against my ribs, breath coming shallow. Training kicked in too late. I scanned the corridor, checked the door seal, the cameras. Everything was unchanged. The prisoner hadn't moved. His feet were planted exactly where they'd been. His hands hung loose at his sides. His eyes were open now, but they weren't focused on the camera. They were focused on me. I tried to speak. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The thought returned, heavier this time, layered with something vast and old. "You hear because you are close, not because I chose you." Images followed, uninvited, crashing into my mind with the force of artillery. I saw the desert as it once was, green, threaded with rivers, crowded with stone cities whose names meant nothing to me. Armies clashed under banners I didn't recognize, bronze and iron biting into flesh, blood soaking into soil that looked identical to the ground above us now. The scene shifted without warning. Centuries passed in heartbeats. Gunpowder replaced blades. Lines of soldiers marched in uniforms faded by time, rifles raised, eyes hollow with the same fear I'd seen in my own reflection. Explosions tore the land open. Trenches filled with bodies. The sand drank everything. The visions kept coming. Different eras, same ground, same outcome. The land burned, recovered, and burned again. Empires declared themselves eternal and vanished in dust. The only constant was the witness, always present, always watching, bound beneath it all. I felt its perspective overlay my own, the weight of endless observation pressing down until I could barely breathe. This wasn't history as taught in classrooms. This was memory, raw and unfiltered, etched into stone and bone. I staggered to my feet, grabbing the console to keep from collapsing. My fingers passed through the holographic display like it wasn't really there. Panic surged, sharp and useless. "Stop!" I tried to say, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. The prisoner didn't react. He didn't need to. The images slowed on their own, resolving into a final scene. Men in uniforms not unlike ours stood around a pit being dug into the desert. Machinery groaned. Floodlights cut through the night. Fear hung thick in the air, unspoken but shared. They lowered something into the ground, him, and sealed it away with concrete and steel. Not as punishment, as containment, as insurance, as a way to pretend they could bury what they didn't understand. The thought returned, quieter now. They feared what I remember. Understanding hit me harder than the visions. He wasn't dangerous because he could destroy. He was dangerous because he could recall every failure, every war, every justification that ended in mass graves. He was history that couldn't be rewritten, a living record immune to propaganda and forgetting. That was why he'd been anchored here, not to suffer, to prevent. The pressure lifted suddenly, like a hand releasing my skull. I sucked in air, gasping, knees weak, sweat soaked my uniform. The monitors stabilized, alarms never sounded. No log flagged the incident. To the system, nothing had happened. To me, everything had. I sank back into the chair, shaking. My eyes flicked to the feed despite myself. The prisoner's gaze had shifted away. He was no longer looking at me. He was looking down, head bowed slightly, as if the exchange had cost him something too. I felt an unexpected wave of guilt, sharp and disorienting. He hadn't chosen to speak. Proximity had made me receptive, like standing too close to a radio transmitter and picking up a signal meant for no one. I logged the event with trembling hands, stripping it of meaning, sanding it down to something sterile and useless. Subject anomaly detected. Perceptual irregularity experienced by God. Recommend evaluation. Even as I typed it, I knew how it would be received. Psychological episode. Fatigue. Stress. They wouldn't hear the warning because it wasn't delivered in a format they respected. Later that shift, a technician came down to recalibrate sensors. He avoided my eyes, worked quickly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He nodded, face pale, and left without another word. From that night on, Sublevel 7 felt different, not more threatening, more resigned, like something ancient had accepted that the cycle was repeating yet again. I began to notice small changes above ground too. Meetings held behind closed doors, increased funding requests, scientists pushing for deeper scans, more invasive procedures. They were excited, focused, hungry. They spoke about extraction, about leveraging unique properties, about predictive modeling that could change warfare forever. They hadn't seen what I'd seen, or worse, they had, and chose to ignore the meaning. I understood then that the prisoner wasn't the experiment. He was the restraint, the last barrier between humanity and its own worst instincts. And barriers, I knew from experience, were only valued until someone decided they were in the way. Command didn't want warnings, they wanted results. The moment they decided to cut into him was the moment the desert stopped pretending we were welcome. The shift change briefing was packed tighter than usual. Bodies shoulder to shoulder, air thick with recycled breath and tension. No jokes, no casual profanity. The scientists stood apart from us, tablets clutched like shields, eyes bright with the kind of focus that comes from believing you're on the edge of something historic. They didn't use the word testing anymore. They said engagement, interface, extraction. Every term carefully chosen to make what they were about to do sound less like a violation. Sublevel 7 went into partial lockdown that same day. Additional power routed downward. New equipment brought in under sealed tarps. Tools I didn't recognize. Long, articulated arms with sensor arrays at the tips, drills that hummed at frequencies I felt in my teeth, not my ears. The door to the prisoner's chamber was open for the first time since I'd arrived. Not wide, just enough to slide the apparatus through. I wasn't assigned to the operation, but I was close enough to feel the air change when the seal broke. The pressure dropped, subtle but unmistakable, like the facility had exhaled against its will. The first sign that containment was failing didn't come from Sublevel 7. It came from above. Lights flickered across the entire base, not in a rolling blackout, but in sharp staccato pulses. Backup generators kicked on without being triggered. Control panels spat error messages that contradicted each other. Engineers scrambled, arguing over diagnostics that refused to make sense. Outside, the wind rose fast, howling against concrete with a force that shouldn't have been possible given the forecasts. Sand slammed into the walls hard enough to leave marks. Down below, the prisoner remained still. The monitors showed no reaction, no movement, no visible change. Yet every instinct I had screamed that something fundamental had shifted. The invasive arm made contact with his skin, or what passed for it, and the feed distorted, colors bleeding into each other like overheated film. Sensors spiked, then flatlined. The scientists leaned closer, voices overlapping with excitement and confusion. Data streamed in that didn't fit any model they had prepared for. That was when the hallucinations started. At first, they were dismissed as isolated incidents. A technician reported hearing his mother calling his name from an empty hallway. A guard swore he saw figures standing just beyond the perimeter lights, watching silently before dissolving into blowing sand. Medics attributed it to sleep deprivation, stress, environmental factors. But the reports multiplied, clustered tightly around Sublevel 7. People saw memories that weren't theirs, childhood homes they'd never lived in, faces they didn't recognize yet somehow mourned. Others experienced flashes of future moments with terrifying clarity. Cities burning, skies filled with aircraft, familiar uniforms scattered lifeless across unfamiliar terrain. One of the night guards, a quiet kid barely old enough to drink, stopped me outside the mess hall. His hands were shaking so badly he had to clasp them together. He told me the prisoner had shown him what was coming, not metaphorically, not symbolically. He said he'd stood there, inside a moment that hadn't happened yet, watching himself die in a war that hadn't been declared. I tried to calm him, told him it was stress, that the base psychologist could help. He looked at me with a kind of pity I didn't deserve. "You think this place is the danger," he said softly. They found him 2 hours later in a maintenance corridor, sidearm discharged once beneath his chin. No note, no hesitation marks, just a look frozen on his face that wasn't fear. It was certainty. The official report labeled it an unfortunate but unrelated suicide. The desert answered that lie with a storm so violent it tore antennae from their mounts and buried vehicles to their axles in minutes. From that point on, everything unraveled quickly. Electrical systems failed in patterns that defied redundancy. Secure doors unlocked themselves, then refused to open at all. The chanting returned at night, louder now, layered with something that felt like grief. Scientists argued openly with command, pushing for more aggressive engagement, even as evidence mounted that every intrusion made things worse. They believed the prisoner was reacting defensively. I knew better. He wasn't resisting. He was remembering and sharing that memory indiscriminately with anyone close enough to touch it. I stopped seeing Sublevel 7 as a cell. It was a focal point, an anchor driven deep into something ancient and aware. The more they tried to manipulate it, the more the surrounding reality destabilized, like stress fractures spreading from a single fault line. The desert wasn't attacking us. It was responding, correcting an imbalance we'd introduced by pretending we were in control. During one particularly severe storm, I was ordered to assist with an emergency shutdown in the lower levels. Sand-infiltrated ventilation shafts, grinding machinery to a halt. As I moved through the corridor, lights flickering overhead, I felt that familiar pressure building again, heavier than before. Not intrusive this time, observant. The thought surfaced unbidden, steady and mournful. You are not the first to believe walls make prisons. Understanding settled over me with brutal clarity. The prisoner wasn't confined by concrete and steel. He was bound by proximity. By being placed at the center of our operations, we had effectively built ourselves around him, trapped within the radius of his memory and awareness. Every system, every person, every decision orbited that chamber. We weren't guarding him, we were inside his reach. The scientists finally crossed a line they couldn't walk back from. They attempted a deep extraction, something designed to peel back whatever layers made him what he was. The moment the apparatus activated, the base lost power completely. Not just locally, regionally. Satellites dropped. Communications died. Outside, the storm reached a pitch I'd never experienced. Sand moving like a living thing, reshaping dunes in minutes, erasing tracks, swallowing structures that had stood for decades. Inside Sublevel 7, the monitors went dark. Emergency lighting flickered weakly. For the first time since I'd arrived, the prisoner moved. Not violently, not suddenly. He turned his head, slow and deliberate, and looked directly at the camera that no longer transmitted. At us. The thought came one last time, heavy with inevitability. This is why I was buried. Alarms finally sounded then, too late to matter. Evacuation protocols initiated in fragments, conflicting orders issued and rescinded. People ran, others froze. Somewhere deep below, something ancient and patient remained exactly where it had always been, while the world built around it began to collapse. When evacuation orders came, it was already too late. The night the sand opened, I learned the difference between escape and release. The storm swallowed the sky without warning. One moment, the desert beyond the blast doors was barely visible through sheets of wind-driven sand. The next, it was gone entirely, erased as if the world ended 10 meters from the wall. The blackout followed seconds later. Not a flicker, not a surge. Everything died at once. Lights, monitors, environmental controls, leaving only the emergency strips glowing dim red along the floor like exposed veins. The silence that followed was worse than the alarms would have been. It felt intentional, like something had reached up and cut the power to be alone with us. I was already moving before the first impact shook the facility. Training took over, pushing fear aside just long enough to function. The corridor bucked under my boots as if something massive had struck it from below. Concrete groaned. Dust rained from the ceiling. Over the internal channel, voices shouted half-formed commands that overlapped and collapsed into static. No one was in charge anymore. Whatever hierarchy had existed dissolved the moment the systems failed. Then the doors began to unlock, not all at once, one by one. Heavy security doors slid open with a wet, mechanical sound, seals peeling back as if pried loose by unseen hands. I watched in disbelief as clearance indicators flashed green without any authentication. Sublevels that had never been meant to connect suddenly bled into each other, corridors opening into darkness that hadn't existed on any map. Somewhere above me, something exploded, sharp, concussive, followed by screaming that cut off too abruptly to be comforting. I knew where I was going before I consciously decided. Sublevel 7 pulled at me like gravity, not panic, not duty, certainty. I ran against the flow of evacuating personnel, shouldering past men and women whose faces were pale with terror, eyes reflecting the same realization I'd already accepted. The base wasn't failing. It was being dismantled. The elevator was dead, doors jammed halfway open. I took the stairs 2 at a time, emergency lights stuttering overhead. With every level descended, the air grew denser, vibrating faintly as if charged. The chanting returned, not loud, not directional, but everywhere at once, woven into the rumble of the storm and the grinding of collapsing infrastructure. It wasn't summoning, it wasn't threatening, it felt like acknowledgement. When I reached the corridor leading to Sublevel 7, I stopped short. The reinforced door at the end, the one that had never opened fully, stood wide open. The locking mechanisms hung uselessly, warped and twisted, as if they'd been softened and bent by heat rather than forced. Beyond it, the chamber glowed faintly, illuminated by a light source I couldn't identify. Not emergency lighting, not equipment, just a soft, steady luminance that didn't cast shadows the way it should have. I raised my rifle out of habit, though I knew it was meaningless. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. Fear had burned itself out, leaving clarity in its wake. I stepped through the threshold, boots crunching on debris that hadn't been there before. Flakes of concrete, shards of metal, dust that felt warm despite the cooling air. The prisoner stood exactly where he always had. No restraints, no wounds, no sign that anything in the world had changed. He wasn't bound to the floor, yet the circular depression beneath his feet pulsed faintly, lines etched into the stone glowing like embers under ash. His posture was relaxed, almost contemplative. His eyes were open, focused not on me, but on the ceiling far above, as if he could see through layers of earth and storm to the chaos unfolding on the surface. "You're free," I said before I could stop myself. The words echoed weakly, swallowed by the chamber. The thought came gently this time, tinged with something close to sorrow. Freedom requires movement. Understanding settled in pieces. He hadn't waited for the breach to escape because he had nowhere to go. This place wasn't a cage. It was an anchor point, a convergence. He remained because remaining was the point. The collapse happening around us wasn't his liberation, it was the consequence of our intrusion reaching its inevitable conclusion. Another tremor rocked the chamber, stronger than the rest. The ceiling cracked, dust pouring down in thick curtains. Somewhere deep below, stone shifted. ancient and reluctant, like tectonic plates grinding past each other. I realized then that the desert wasn't opening above us. It was opening beneath us. Sinkholes forming, foundations giving way, the land reclaiming what had been forced into it. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall. The prisoner finally lowered his gaze, meeting my eyes directly. Up close, his features were more defined than they appeared on the monitors, etched with lines that suggested age without decay. His eyes held no malice, no urgency, only awareness. "You will leave," the thought pressed into me. Not a command, a statement of fact. I asked. My voice sounded small in the vastness of the chamber. For the first time I felt something like hesitation from him. "Because you listened. Because memory must travel." Another explosion tore through the facility, close enough that the floor split open along a jagged seam. Heat rushed up from below, carrying the smell of scorched earth and something older, metallic and bitter. The chanting stopped. In its place came a deep, resonant sound, like stone settling into a shape it preferred. The base was collapsing inward, folding around Sublevel 7 as if sealing a wound. I backed toward the door, every instinct screaming to run. The prisoner didn't follow. He didn't even shift his weight. He watched, not me, but the structure, the systems, the human attempt at permanence crumbling in real time. There was no triumph in his expression, only completion. At the threshold, I turned back one last time. I asked, though I already sensed the answer. "What always happens," he replied. "The ground closes. The witnesses remain. The light in the chamber dimmed, the glow fading back into stone. The etched lines beneath his feet went dark. He lowered his head slightly, resuming the posture I'd seen 100 times before. Contained not by walls, but by purpose. I ran. The corridors were unrecognizable, warped by collapse and shifting earth. I climbed through debris, ducked falling beams, followed emergency markings that flickered in and out of existence. Above ground, the storm raged with apocalyptic fury. Sand poured into the facility through ruptured ceilings, filling hallways like water. I emerged coughing into the night just as the ground behind me gave way entirely, the base sinking into itself with a sound like a drawn-out sigh. By the time the horizon lightened, there was nothing left but a scar in the desert, already softening under drifting sand. Before dawn, only one of us would leave. He did not ask me to save him. He asked me to remember. I didn't stop running until my lungs burned and the taste of sand coated my tongue like ash. The storm chased me across the flats, wind screaming low and furious, but behind that sound was something deeper, a pressure that followed without pursuit. I collapsed behind a half-buried transport truck that had been abandoned mid-evacuation, curled against the metal as the desert roared overhead. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I'd made it out. Then the ground vibrated beneath my ribs, slow and deliberate, and I knew he hadn't finished speaking. The world narrowed again, not violently this time. No visions crashing through me, no flood of Chuj memories. Just stillness. The storm dulled, like someone turning a dial. The darkness behind my eyes warmed, and the thought arrived with clarity so complete it hurt. "You are between choices," he said. "Not allowed. Never allowed." The desert seemed to hold its breath around the words. I was no longer certain I was still crouched behind the truck. The sensation of my body faded, replaced by awareness, wide, layered, ancient. I felt the weight of stone above, the depth of earth below, the countless footprints pressed into sand over millennia. I felt him too, anchored far beneath where the base had been, unchanged by collapse or time. He did not move toward me. He did not need to. "You may stay," he continued, and the image formed instantly. Myself buried beneath the wreckage, bones mingling with concrete and steel, my existence reduced to a missing person report that would never be filed. No grave, no record, forgotten cleanly, efficiently, the kind of disappearance my employers specialized in. You would become part of the silence. The second image followed without pause. Me walking away. Years passing. The memory of him carried like a fracture that never healed. Sleepless nights. Questions I couldn't answer without sounding insane. The burden of knowing why wars repeat, why land keeps drinking blood, why men keep building monuments over graves they swear are foundations. You would remember, he said, and remembering has a cost. I asked, or thought. The word felt small against what he was. There was a pause then, not absence but consideration. Because memory must be carried by the living, he answered. Stone remembers without mercy, men remember imperfectly. That imperfection is necessary. The understanding settled slowly. He wasn't an executioner. He wasn't a jailer. He was a witness in the truest sense, incapable of intervention, incapable of forgetting. Humanity, on the other hand, survived by forgetting selectively, by sanding down horrors into statistics and ceremonies. That forgetting allowed wars to happen again. It allowed leaders to promise glory where there was only repetition. He didn't stop wars because stopping them would erase the lesson. He let them happen so they would be remembered if someone was willing to carry it forward. They buried me to silence what I see, he continued. But silence has never stopped conflict. It only delays understanding. I felt the truth of it in my bones. Every battlefield I'd walked, every briefing that reduced civilian casualties to collateral figures, every monument erected decades later, stripped of context and pain. We honored the dead without listening to them. We remembered dates, not consequences. He was the accumulation of all that unlearned history, pressed into something that could not lie. I asked. The land will close, he replied. The anchor will hold, the cycle will continue. You will be forgotten quickly, he said, not unkindly, but you will not be alone. The storm surged again at the edge of my perception, impatient. Time was reasserting itself. My heart pounded as sensation rushed back. Cold metal against my shoulder, sand stinging my face, breath tearing in and out of my chest. I realized then that he wasn't trying to persuade me. The choice was real, and it was mine. That frightened me more than any command ever had. I thought of the guard who'd taken his own life after seeing the future, of the scientists who believed knowledge could be extracted without consequence, of the locals who drew lines in the sand and refused to cross them. I thought of how easy it would be to lie down, to let the desert finish what the base had started, to become another layer of sediment over an inconvenient truth. I stood instead. The storm screamed its displeasure, wind slamming into me hard enough to stagger. I turned away from the collapse site, away from the place where Sublevel 7 now lay sealed beneath shifting earth. With each step, the pressure eased. The thought lingered one last time, steady and final. Carry it intact, he said. Do not sharpen it into a weapon. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I ran until the storm thinned and the sky began to pale at the edges. Behind me, the ground settled with a sound like a closing door. By sunrise, the facility was gone. No crater, no wreckage, just uninterrupted desert stretching to the horizon, already smoothing over the wound. Extraction found me hours later, dehydrated, half delirious, babbling about system failures and structural collapse. They listened without hearing. Reports were filed, NDAs reinforced. The site was officially declared non-existent. I was paid, discharged, and quietly advised never to speak of the assignment again. I didn't argue. I knew better than to expect understanding, but memory doesn't obey orders. Years passed. I left the work, tried to build something resembling a normal life, yet every conflict that flared across the news carried a familiar weight. Different uniforms, same language, same justifications. I saw the patterns now, clear as fault lines. I recognized the land in satellite images. could feel when wars were fought on soil that had already learned the lesson too many times. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I swear I hear the wind shift in a way that feels deliberate, like acknowledgement, like something ancient taking note that the memory is still being carried. Years later, the desert still whispers his name. They erased the site from every record, but erasure is not the same as forgetting. Officially, nothing happened in that desert. No facility, no blackout storm, no collapse. When inquiries surfaced months later, satellite gaps, missing personnel, conflicting logistics reports, they were smoothed over by committees that specialized in smoothing. Coordinates were mislabeled. Imagery was reclassified. The land itself was listed as an error in mapping software, a blank space corrected by newer data. To the world, the assignment with no name concluded exactly as it was designed to, silently. Unofficially, the desert remembered everything. I learned that years later, long after I'd stopped wearing uniforms and answering to call signs. I was halfway across the world when I overheard two aid workers talking in a bar about a stretch of land locals refused to cross. Same desert, different border. They spoke about vehicles that lost power for no mechanical reason, about sandstorms that formed around nothing and dispersed just as quickly, about elders who warned their children never to spill blood there, because the ground was already full. I sat quietly, nursing a drink, feeling the old pressure settle behind my eyes like a familiar ache. I never went back. I didn't need to. The memory traveled well enough on its own. The people who lived closest to where the facility had been didn't need classified briefings to understand something was wrong. Trade routes shifted. Nomadic paths curved away from that region like water flowing around a stone. Stories spread not as panic, but as caution. They spoke of a place where the wind listened, where the earth paid attention, where the past lay close enough to the surface to reach up and touch the present. Children were warned not to dig too deep, not to ask certain questions, not because answers were forbidden, but because they were heavy. I told my story once, years after the fact, to a journalist who specialized in war legends and unexplained military operations. I stripped it of specifics, softened the edges, framed it like a confession filtered through exhaustion and regret. He listened politely, recorded everything, then thanked me and admitted it would never make print. Too unverifiable, too strange, too inconvenient. I understood. Some truths don't survive contact with fact-checkers. They survive as something else, as legend. Legends don't demand belief. They ask for caution. They linger where official narratives fail, carried by whispers and half-remembered warnings. Over time, my account transformed the same way. Details blurred, motives shifted. The prisoner became a guardian, then a curse, then a metaphor. But at the center of every version was the same idea, that the land had seen too much and something beneath it refused to let the memory fade. That's how he endures. Not in documents, not in archives, in stories told quietly, without dates or coordinates, passed between people who've learned to respect places where history accumulates instead of passing. He doesn't need belief. He only needs remembrance. The kind that makes you hesitate before repeating the same mistakes on familiar ground. I still follow conflicts the way some men follow weather patterns. I watch troop movements, listen to rhetoric cycle back on itself, notice how often wars return to landscapes already scarred by previous ones. When fighting breaks out near deserts with long memories, I feel it, a subtle tightening, like the world leaning forward to see if the lesson will finally be learned. It never is, not completely. Perhaps that's why he remains. I understand now that he was never meant to stop war. That would imply an ending humanity hasn't earned. His role is simpler and more cruel. He watches, he remembers. He ensures that no war is ever truly new, no matter how desperately leaders insist otherwise. The weight of accumulated memory presses into the land until it reshapes behavior. Not immediately, Not dramatically, but slowly, through unease and avoidance and stories told around fires. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine him beneath the sand as he's always been. Not pacing, not waiting, simply present. A fixed point in a world that refuses to learn efficiently. I imagine the next conflict unfolding somewhere above him, boots churning soil that's already soaked with history. I wonder if the soldiers feel it, the way the ground seems to watch, the way the wind carries more than dust. Some of them will, some won't. The difference has always mattered. I've carried the memory as he asked, intact. I haven't turned it into a weapon or a warning label or a sermon. I tell it when it fits, when someone is already listening for reasons they can't quite articulate. I let it sit unresolved. That's how it's meant to exist, not as proof but as weight. The facility is gone, the paperwork burned, the men who built it scattered into other projects, other secrets. But the legend persists because legends don't require clearance. They survive because they're too heavy to archive, too honest to file away neatly. They exist where history and conscience overlap, reminding us that forgetting is not the same as healing. Some nights, when the world feels especially loud with threats and justifications, I step outside and listen to the wind. I don't expect answers. I don't ask questions. I just acknowledge that somewhere, beneath shifting sand and stubborn memory, the witness remains, watching the next war begin, as he has watched all the others. Some secrets aren't classified to protect nations. They're hidden to protect us from what we'd have to admit.